Hi, welcome back. Here we are for Module 6. This is where we're going to consider sport, the political, and the spectacle. We'll be pulling from GEMS Chapter 9 and Chapters 12, 14, and 15 in Wiggins. This lecture is going to center on the years of approximately 1950 to 1980. A couple of ways that we can think about this lecture. It's this notion of sport transforms and sport transformed. In the early 1950s, it could have been thought that we were going through a second golden age of sport. Why? Technology had enabled greater sporting performances. We saw dramatic increases in pole vault performances, in tennis and tennis rackets, and golf clubs. We even saw a couple of epic achievements that would mark our American sport history. One, Hillary and Norgay climbed Mount Everest. And maybe one of the most famous is Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. Although we were in post-war America and there was a facade of stability, there were a number of underlying tensions that were still at play. For Americans, sport in the Cold War was a dose of reality and maybe even panic. Why? There were two reasons. One, we were concerned about our fitness, and ultimately we were concerned that if we were a poor, fit country, how would that impact us in war? The Cross-Weber physical fitness test showed that 60% of American youth failed the test, while only 9% of Europeans did so. The government was troubled by these results. We were concerned that we were a nation of spectators, not practitioners. As a result, President Eisenhower established the Presidential Physical Fitness Commission in 1955. I'm sure some of you, even growing up, took part in the Presidential Fitness Test in your physical education courses. Why was this lack of fitness such a concern? Because our confidence was shaken in our athletic and scientific superiority. Remember, our ideologies were at stake. This idea of if we were unable to be physically fit, which was our surrogate for war, how would we then dominate war and or international sporting competitions? A couple of other things sparked concern for us. In 1952, the Soviet Union joined the Olympic movement, and they ultimately dominated. Soviet women dominated and experienced immediate success. And in the 1960 Winter Games, the Soviets in general dominated this. Therefore, sport in the Cold War, as I said earlier, for Americans, was a dose of reality and maybe even panic. Throughout this time frame of approximately 1950 to 1980, this relationship between the sport and the media evolved. Even early on, it was evident to both the sports side and the media side that there were mutual benefits for this relationship. As I talked at the end of Module 5, telecasts were beginning of sport. And as I also mentioned at the end of Module 5, this notion that TVs weren't necessarily readily available in all homes. This slide gives it some perspective. The TV becomes a social phenomenon. In 1948, there were only roughly 7,000 TV sets in homes. By 1950, though, there are 4 million TV sets in homes. And then by 53, there are 20 million TV sets in homes. So what does this TV coverage do? First of all, it created this kind of celebrity status of athletes, and also because of some of the turmoil and the tension of the time, watching sports became a social opiate. Also, because of TV, there were some on-the-field changes, including timeouts in order for commercials and or TV timeouts, and ultimately the times at which games were played. Because of the evolution of TV, also, glorified athletic heroes were on the rise throughout this time. This slide just gives a little bit of indication as to how this took place. First, we saw some key sponsorship as Gillette, sponsored TV bouts of boxing. There were Hall of Fames that began to rise throughout this time, and in doing so, it glorified stars. Bobby Hull and Gordie Howe were common popular names in hockey. And as we know in golf, Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer, also we started seeing this concept of Arnie's Army, spurred a strong interest in televised golf. Throughout this time, sport was transformed. That is, how sport was televised underwent a transformation. Sport garnered large audiences, and part of the reason was because of Rune Arledge. He was a key innovator in TV technology and how we broadcasted sports. First of all, he brought about this concept of multiple cameras or multiple angles. It changed the way spectators or viewers were able to view it. Also were included interviews with competitors and fans, brought the spectator or viewer closer to the athletes. With the rise of television also came the rise of the viewing of alternative sport heroes. Sport offered a visible example of some racial integration that was going on in our country at this time. Although TV was still mostly conservative, it did offer a few more sides of the political spectrum. A couple of key examples of that include Sandy Koufax observing Yom Kippur and missing Game 1 of the 1965 World Series. Roberto Clemente represented the Latin American community, and Dick Butkus was displayed as a football working class hero. And again, this connection comes because TV ultimately brought a number of these alternative heroes to light. In this slide and throughout the remaining slides of the lecture, we're going to make this connection between sport and civil rights activism. First, in this slide, we're going to talk briefly about how sporting stars became activists and made strong statements regarding civil rights. A couple key figures: Althea Gibson and Arthur Ashe, Jim Brown, Bill Russell and Lou Alcindor, we later know as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and also Billie Mills. These people will be key in pushing for civil rights and using their platform as star athletes to push for civil rights. An interesting side to sport and civil rights activism is this notion of the Jewish impact. Norwood and Brackman talk about this in detail in Wiggins chapter 12. They discuss how instrumental the Jewish community and key Jewish baseball players were in helping Jackie Robinson break the color barrier. This account that Norwood and Brackman give is often a rare and not a readily explained account. It makes sense. The Jewish people also sought social reform, and in helping push Jackie Robinson through, they too received some social reform. Any historical account of sport and civil rights activism must include Muhammad Ali. He is arguably the greatest figure that to connect sport and civil rights activism. He led what was called the Athletic Revolution. This was ultimately against sports conservatism. He was formerly known as Cassius Clay before he converted to Islam. Many question whether Ali was the devil incarnate or a symbol of black retribution. In actuality, though, it was far more nuanced than that. He created this interesting dynamic of race, religion, and patriotism. In chapter 14 of his own text, Wiggins considers in great detail Ali's religious influence. Ali's conformity to Muslim theology ultimately dictated his influence on the black community and broader American society. It's important to note that not only was Ali a great athlete, but he was also a key activist. He used his athletic platform to push for social reform. And in that activism, Ali's connection to his Muslim beliefs cannot be left out. Oftentimes, we consider Ali a civil rights activist for racial reform. And in many ways, religious reform also needs to be included in his push for civil rights. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, a number of key black athletes revolted or boycotted in order to protest the civil unrest happening in the U.S. AFL All-Star Game was boycotted by black athletes. Harry Edwards led an Olympic project for human rights, and possibly one of the most famous black athletic revolts, and commonly an image that still brings a lot of emotion to people today, is Tommie Smith and John Carlos on the medal stand at the 1968 Olympic Games in their black glove salute. As a result of that, Smith and Carlos were banned from Olympic competition. In addition to sport being a key site for civil rights activism, sport also became an area for women's rights to be protested. Billie Jean King is important in her role that she had in fighting for women's rights at this time. King, a prominent tennis player, exposed Wimbledon gender hypocrisy. She also went on to defeat Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes. One of the important areas that King brought out is that she fought and eventually succeeded in equal pay for women at tennis tournaments. That is, the champion of, say, Wimbledon in the men's competition would receive the same pay as the champion in the women's competition. On the heels of the civil rights movement and ultimately civil rights legislation came some legislation that required gender equity in education. It's Title IX. This states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The intention of this law, enacted in 1972, was for education. However, we know it today that it has consistently challenged sport inequities for girls and women. Following Title IX's enactment, women and girls saw dramatic increases in opportunities to compete, college scholarships, in addition to accessibility to coaches and facilities. Grundy and Shackelford in Wiggins's Chapter 15 provide this detailed first-hand experience or stories of individual women and groups of women fighting for their Title IX rights. They give a heartfelt rundown of a group of Stanford women's basketball players that fight for a new facility and an actual paid coach in 1974. One of the other stories is about Judy Rose, coach of UNC Charlotte, and how she struggled to build a program. There's also an interesting discussion from Tara Vanderveer. She recounts her struggle as a young athlete and also talks about her transition to her role today as the head coach of the Stanford women's basketball team. This article in Wiggins provides some details of what these fights looked like for these individual women and groups of women as they fought for their rights under Title IX. Here we are at the end of our Module 6 lecture. Once again, here are some questions for thought. Use them as fact checks, as well as be able to use them as points of application.